Today's episode is supported by the Institute for National Defense and Security Research in Taiwan, a think tank dedicated to fueling knowledge-based policy analyses and strategic assessments on Taiwan's security.
Taiwan is in a unique position because its largest trading partner is also its largest military threat. Like many other countries globally, Taiwan has been increasingly engaging economically with China since the early 1990s. But this process has been fraught and complicated from the beginning. China is at once an opportunity and a risk, a partner and a foe. Although many countries across the Asia-Pacific have begun reconsidering how to balance what they get in return for trading with China, these questions have always been rather existential in Taiwan. It's a life or death issue here. Trade policies have oscillated inconsistently between opening up and restricting access to the Chinese economy. The challenges of doing trade with China is a global issue, and this is the Taiwan Take. I'm your host, J.R. Wu. Welcome to a new episode.
Taiwan is a very good example of a society that has worked really hard, striving to have more freedom, to be more democratic, and to be a progressive society. It's really wonderful to see Taiwan as one of the most progressive societies in the world, not just in Asia, but under threat by a neighbor that is very important to Taiwan, yet has a different sense of what is important.
Today we speak with political scientist Shirley Lin, Syaru, to try to understand the intimate links in trade across the Taiwan Strait and, ironically, how Taiwan has made China stronger economically. Shirley blazed a trail as a partner at Goldman Sachs when she worked at the premier white shoe firm primarily in the 1990s. Her book, Taiwan's China Dilemma, was published in 2016 in English and came out earlier this year in the Chinese language. It maps out the economic ties between Taiwan and China and what drives the policymaking in that area. It includes insights from her experience and conversations with public and private sector leaders. Taiwanese business luminaries like Morris Chang, Terry Guo, and Earl Ho. She now splits her time as a professor at universities in the US, in Hong Kong, and in China. Good to have you on the show, Shirley.
Very happy to be here. Thank you.
So, what is Taiwan's China Dilemma, and have you updated your book?
Taiwan's China Dilemma is about national identity and its relations to Taiwan's cross-strait economic policy. It's actually a title that my editor changed last minute. I had a rather sophisticated, I thought, title to explain the oscillation of Taiwan's economic policy toward China, how Taiwanese society, both public, private sector, as well as the society at large, what are they thinking? What are their considerations? And since I've written the book and published it, I have to thank Donald Trump for being my best promoter, because 3 months after the book was published, he took a call from President Ing-wen, and everybody started saying... I remember
that, December 2016.
Yes. Suddenly, English readers started saying, where is Taiwan? And so they will look up books, and mine was one of the newest.
For our listeners, I want you to back up just a little bit and paint us the picture of the ties between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. For instance, as best I understand, in 1993, you were working at Goldman Sachs in Singapore. There was historic talks between the two political parties, the Chinese Communist Party and the KMT, Kuomintang, in Singapore. First time in over 5 decades, they met, and you helped translate materials into English for those historic talks. Walk us through from that point how Taiwan's economic policy towards China has changed through now 4 government administrations here.
The Kuang talk is very special to me because when I went to college, I was the only Taiwanese student in my class at Harvard College. Throughout college, I thought I needed to graduate, gain some expertise to come back and help Taiwan in its effort to democratize. But before I graduated, Taiwan became a democracy.
Because it had been under martial law for 40 years, right?
That's right. So I started to do things here and there to see where I could make a difference. And one of the things I did as a third-year student, a junior, was I translated Yu Fu, a cartoon collection called Taiwan Without Martial Law. So it was about this transition to a democratic society. After I translated the book, the Kuang talk started to be planned. And so in 1993, I was working at Goldman Sachs for the largest IPO at the time, Singapore Telecom. I was a privatization expert. We worked basically 24/7. So in the evening, Yu Fu came with all of these journalists. And of course, without martial law, Taiwan suddenly had a lot of newspapers, TV stations, and most of them didn't have English-speaking translators or journalists. And at the Kuang talk, everyone needed to cover it. So every night after work, I would go, whether it's 6 p.m., 9 p.m., or 10 p.m., and see what I could do. And I would help different press translate what they wanted to translate, press release in English. It was really exciting. But I think, JR, the most exciting part and the most interesting part I tell young people is that in no way did anybody there or myself, nobody could have imagined that since 1993 to 2019, so little has changed and so little progress has been made in breaking the stalemate in the Taiwan Strait. So we were full of optimism for what would come. And there are many scenarios, but we were there thinking we're really making history. Now looking back, I'm not so sure.
But China is now Taiwan's largest trading partner. Isn't that supposed to be an achievement?
I think that is an economic achievement, but that's all it is. And I think what you've mentioned, obviously, is lifting millions of people out of poverty is a wonderful accomplishment. But for those people on the island here in Taiwan, what does it mean for them that Taiwan has become a more powerful economy? In many ways, it actually has been very troublesome or challenging, if you will, to look at exactly what do the Taiwanese want after they've achieved a certain level of prosperity. And that's where my next book is heading to investigate Taiwan as a high-income society and what challenges it is facing.
Now let's talk more about some of those points in your first book as well. National identity drives economic policy. And based on what you have mapped out in your methodology, that was true for Taiwan from 1993 onwards until 2010, until at least up to 2016, your first book. Tell us how Taiwan's economic policy has been shaped over those years.
The premise of my book, at the time when I was doing this research, there are very, very few scholars who are either interested or specialize in national identity and economic policy. And of course, the reason is very simple. It's a real-world issue, and many times, actually, academics are not very focused on real-world issues. When you talk about national identity, sociologists know a lot more about it. When you talk about economic policy, political scientists, political economists, and economists would claim they know much more about it.
But what you do is you bring the two together, the two disciplines together, and then you look at the issue.
Yes, I bring it together because I started with private sector experience. I wanted to write a book based on economic analysis to show that the distribution of the benefits of integrating with China did not flow to a broad spectrum of society in Taiwan. That's my hypothesis. However, as I started to look further into the issue, I realized national identity was really the key. And today, when I say this, many people understand because when you say national identity, if you look up keyword in New York Times or Washington Post, the last 3 to 5 years, there is a lot more of the word identity than in the previous years. And that is because people feel that they are disrespected, and part of it is socioeconomic challenges, but very important part of it is an entirely different system with different values that the Chinese government promotes. I read the news every day hoping to validate what I have written. But what I wrote basically, as I said before, is national identity determine the way you vote in terms of supporting certain kinds of economic policy. And for other countries, this is basically Brexit, whether you're pro-liberalization, pro-globalization, or more interested in governing well and promoting the welfare of those in your community first. And my book basically show that the Taiwanese people, after 1 to 2 decades of democratic governance, has moved on to say, all of us are actually Taiwanese. And this is very important. As Taiwanese identity consolidated, it was no longer the case that a politician could say, vote for me because I'm Taiwanese and I'm going to stop investments into China. That was no longer something that worked. And that people started to say, we are all Taiwanese. So based on that, how can we move the economy forward and be more dynamic as an economy, as a society, and at the same time safeguard our values, which are freedom, democracy. The government has to evolve, has to change with the newer generations. And you could see that since 2016, the DPP has been under a lot of stress because national identity no longer differentiated, I would say, leaders of the DPP and the KMT, and good governance has to be the basis of any party that's elected into the executive branch or the legislative branch. Now, I would say something has really changed, and I need to write a sequel to my book in the sense that Han Guo-yu and Tsai Ing-wen today, the two leading presidential candidates for the 2020 presidential election, actually have regressed according to my framework in that one actually is really looking to further integration with China as a solution to what I call Taiwan's high income trap, whereas Tsai Ing-wen has decided that we need to diversify to engage in trade and investment with many more countries so that we don't single-handedly rely on China. And in that way, actually, the two parties are going back to be distinct in their sense of national identity. And this is something I would say that I didn't really expect. And it is very surprising and challenging because the DPP needs to show it can walk the tightrope, and so does the KMT. And neither party actually is fully able to convince voters that they can walk the tightrope in securing Taiwan's economic future as well as safeguarding Taiwan's autonomy convincingly.
Shirley, give us some direct examples from Taiwan's own history. I'll be honest, I watched this fantastic presentation that you gave. It was the year your book was published in 2016. I think it was at Stanford University. And you walked that audience through southbound policy the first time round in 1993. Then you walked them through no haste, be patient. Then you walked them through the semiconductor opening and ECFA. You also mentioned Taiwan first. You mentioned make Taiwan great again. And again, listening to it, 4 years later now, it's still fresh to me. Let's give our listeners a little bit of that too.
Yes, the history is very important to really appreciate how identity changes one's views on economic policy. The reason that the Taiwanese, of course, have oscillated sometimes more moderately, sometimes more drastically, going from Li Teng-hui's Go South and then Li Teng-hui's No Haste, which prohibited major strategic industries from investing in China, and then moving actually, ironically, to under Chen Shui-bian to liberalize economic policy in an attempt to open the semiconductor industry to investing in China. And then in his second term, Chen Shui-bian decided to restrict semiconductor investments in China. And then, of course, we know after Ma Ying-jeou, there was very, very broad liberalization, including many people have forgotten now in 2009, there was an effort before ECFA to have Chinese investments in Taiwan. So it was the first time under Ma Ying-jeou in 2008 to 2016, the Chinese government worked with Ma Ying-jeou to discuss bilateral liberalization, which is unlike the previous unilateral liberalization or restriction. And so this, of course, led to what we all remember the sunflower movement as a backlash towards liberalization without consensus or without consultation with the Taiwanese public. Since my book wrapped up, of course, we now have under Tsai Ing-wen, who won in a landslide, the new southbound policy to try to have Taiwan move toward a more balanced economy with more markets and diversification, just as Chinese economic growth is slowing down and is, of course, being challenged to restructure to move from investment-led to consumption-led economic development. But all of this is very important in terms of national identity. Why? Because in the early days, I would say the first 15 years of what I described, most of these economic policy discussions were focused on whether you're Taiwanese or if you're Chinese. And I'm sure, JR, you're thinking the framework sounds right, but how did it determine what economic policy people supported? And in those days, it was rather simple. If you're a Taiwanese, of course, you should support no haste.
The no haste, be patient under Li Denghui, where don't be in such a hurry to invest into China.
That's right. And if you were, you'd identify yourself as Chinese, naturally you should support liberalizing cross-strait relations and especially economic relations. And the simple logic is, if we are all Chinese, whatever benefits this larger economy would benefit us. But if you feel that you're Taiwanese, of course, it would be Taiwan first. And over the last 30 years, many politicians have said Taiwan first. And in the past, people said that's very populist, that's protectionist. Now, this all sounds terribly familiar now. Since 2016, America has shown the world that being protectionist, being populist, I would say they're not dirty words. It's just a way to understand how people feel. And in a democracy, you have to understand what people are thinking and respect their identity, respect their values.
Now, Shirley, in retrospect, it seems everything would be obvious. Now, what I want you to do is reverse engineer research outcomes that are not apparent yet, since your book stops ahead of the year 2016. Since the 2016 presidential and national election, the ruling party's support with voters has been chipped away. The ruling party is less China-friendly ideologically than the opposition KMT. The 2018 local elections for mayors and local chiefs resulted in wins more for the KMT. So what does that trend so far tell us about how Taiwan's economic policies towards China has or will oscillate? And maybe this is part of your second book.
Thank you for that opportunity to go into my current research. My second book is really an extension of my first book, focused on the high-income societies in East Asia. The name of the book will be The High-Income Trap in East Asia, and it will look at Japan, which has been in the high-income trap the longest, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong.
This high-income trap that you keep referring to, tell us a bit more about that. What does it mean in layman's terms?
So high-income status, according to the World Bank definition, the benchmark changes every year, but more or less U.S. $12,000 per capita is when you've moved on to the high-income status. And Taiwan is one of the few countries in the world that have moved on in the last 40 years, along with South Korea, with Poland, and very few large economies actually have done so. And the issue is, once you move into this status, where do you go from here? All of these economies have become wealthier and more prosperous and joined advanced economies because of their export-led developmental growth strategy. However, in the process, many of the priorities were lost, such as more equality. South Korea is the most unequal society, according to the IMF. Taiwan's inequality have deteriorated, especially in the last few years after further integration with China. And Hong Kong and Singapore, everyone knows, are the two most expensive cities to live in. And these issues are compounded by the fact that when economies become wealthy, fertility rate drops and people live longer. As a result, the average age increases, and this is also parallels, of course, greater demand for benefits. And these entitlements that are given to the greater population will be shouldered by the younger generation, and there are fewer of them to begin with. Now, high-income societies around the world are generally democratic. There are very few non-democratic high-income countries. Most of them are small. As a result, when societies become more wealthy, they have more demands placed on the government, and the sense of identity also is stronger than for the last generation. Younger people demand more justice at the same time while they demand more opportunities, just as the economies are becoming less dynamic.
Then what does it mean for cross-strait economic policies from this side of the strait?
So the younger generation in Taiwan, as polls show, vote very differently than the older generation. And today, I think the challenges facing pan-blue parties and political leaders is that the younger generations are not interested in leaders who simply say, we're going to make the economy grow faster. Aggregate GDP growth is simply not a way to appeal. Younger people want to know, will there be fairer distribution? Will wage be reflective of our ability? Will there be jobs that are appropriate to our education? But more importantly, younger generations, because they are not accumulating assets like older generations are, to buy a house, to have cars, to get married early. In fact, in Taipei, it takes a person 15 years to work full-time in order to buy a medium-price apartment. So the end result is really young people are not thinking about buying anything. They live with their parents longer than ever before. And so their incentives are different. And so they are looking for political leaders to focus on social justice, the environment, and not really believing in integrating with China, creating more economic growth in aggregate as a solution to their individual problems.
We'll take a break now, and when we come back, we'll ask Shirley about what she told Congress, what Morris Chang told her, and what she wants young people to know.
Hey, we're a young media startup called Ghost Island Media. To get every episode of the Taiwan Take, just hit subscribe on your podcast app. Do you have a tip for us? For news tips, tweet at us at Ghost Island Me. For dollar tips, send them to us on patreon.com/Taiwan. Patreon. Patreon.com/Taiwan. Back to our interview.
Shirley, sometimes when I think of trade, I don't just think of it for Taiwan as a Taiwan-China dynamic. I see it as a triangle. Not just myself. I think a lot of academics and other folks working in this area do as well. United States, Taiwan, China. There is a trilateral type of economic symbiotic activity, if you will, especially in the tech global supply chain. Now, you testified in the U.S. Congress in September this year ahead of the annual release of the report by the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. How'd you get that gig, and what insights do you think you provided that helped inform that report?
The testimony I provided, I was on a panel with
Bonnie Glaser and Victoria Hui.
Yes.
It was awesome.
Oh, thank you. Actually, it's one of the few panels I've ever been on that is 3 women. So we were very proud as well. But of course, it came because that is the field. And the field, as I'm talking about, actually, that panel was meant to be a Taiwan panel. And because of what happened in Hong Kong, where I've lived for 28 years, they changed the panel to be Hong Kong and Taiwan focused. And there are very few people who actually study both Taiwan and Hong Kong. So for me, it was a very appropriate forum to inform congressional staff and Congress as to what is happening on the ground. And I think my testimony was very short, but more importantly, during the Q&A, all three of us contributed different answers to common questions. And that was, I think, very important to think about what are the challenges facing Hong Kong and Taiwan. I talked a lot about young people and about the leadership of businesses in these communities because they asked about actually Taishang, and they also asked about what the U.S. could do to help these places become more democratic and for people to be able to voice their concerns.
Now, Shirley, you talked about Taishang. These are Taiwanese business leaders. In your book, you include insights from conversations with luminaries like TSMC's Morris Chang, like Foxconn's Terry Guo, like teng-hui's Earl Ho. What are the insights or the takeaway that you've gotten from these business leaders on how this economic relationship between Taiwan and China, or perhaps even including the U.S., should be conducted?
The best part about writing my book was that I had been in business for so long. But when you're in business, you're very focused on maximizing shareholders' interests, at least for the companies we invest in or for our clients. And even though you, in the back of your mind, you understand that business plays a very important role in society, there's not a lot of time to reflect, step back. And during the interview, I was able to go back to the people I have met and become very close to over decades of doing business and ask them what do they think about Taiwan's future. And so that was really exciting. In my years at Goldman, I worked for Hank Paulson, Malcolm Turnbull. I worked very closely with him, the former Prime Minister of Australia. And I knew that eventually we would be switching roles because nobody at Goldman is at Goldman forever. And so as you're talking about these Taiwanese businesses going to China, all of them were very inspirational to me. Now, I would say first and foremost in my book, I highlighted how important Earl Ho was to me, even though actually he's one person I did not do business with who appeared in the book. But he's like a mentor to me. His son went to Harvard with me. And he always talked to me about the importance of Taiwan's future as a democratic, open society.
This is the steel enterprise, right?
Yes. Earl was one of the first leaders to bring Taishang to China, the official delegates. And after each trip, he would consult with governments on both sides and was very, very thoughtful and a deep thinker. And I think that to me is important. Yet, while you're doing business, you can appreciate many of the businesses have a lot, not just one dilemma, many dilemmas, challenges facing them when there are political pressures on both sides. Can you support any of the parties? And if you do, will you be penalized? If you don't support any of the parties, how do you stay out of trouble? To be honest, there's a lot of pressure in Taiwan in the early days. For example, under Chen Shui-bian, and my book, I chronicle how he wanted to show that he meant it. He wanted to restrict semiconductor investments in China. So the Investment Commission would send people to check out the machines that TSMC was going to send to China. And honestly, nobody in the Investment Commission knew anything about the machines, but they would show up, check it out, and make all kinds of problems so that you just couldn't move the machines to China. So in my book, I also talk about Morris Chang, who rarely grants interviews to researchers.
He founded the world's largest contract chip-making company, TSMC.
Yes. So Taiwan Semiconductor is not only a leader in Taiwan, but is a leader in the world. TSMC, the U.S., China, Taiwan technology chain, and the global supply chain is paramount to national security in many ways. And for Morris, I think also he has a lot to say, and his views are that young people should be able to choose wherever they work and whatever they want to do. And this is what makes Taiwan a distinctive society. And in that way of life is what both Morris and Earl repeatedly emphasize in terms of what it means to be Taiwanese. You also mentioned Terry. whom I worked with in making investments in the semiconductor industry in
This
Shanghai.
is that Foxconn founder and chairman, very bright personality.
Yes, and he ran for president. And I am sorry to see him leave the presidential race early because I think businessmen running for political office,
Be careful, that's Trump.
yes, is not a new phenomenon. There have been others in American history and other countries' histories, but generally not very, very successful. I would say that many of the Goldman Sachs partners who've retired and went into government, and there are still several that are prominent, it's really learning something totally new. And I think that if Terry continues to be in the race, he could have shown the Taiwanese, many young people actually were interested in his campaign, whether he could find a way out of Taiwan's dilemma and secure Taiwan's future economically as well as politically in terms of remaining close to both the U.S. and China.
So it sounds like if I'm a policymaker, economic policymaker, I need to be thinking a lot more of the different facets of my policy, not just perhaps in the old school way of GDP, dollars, and getting bigger.
Absolutely. If you look at all sorts of new happiness index, many people probably know that Taiwan has been ranked as the happiest country in Asia for 3 years now, I think, in a row. But it's only still in 24, 25. So it shows you Asia is not a very happy place. And that's exactly because most Asian societies are focused on let's grow more and more. But the newer generation says, well, what is all this growth bringing us? More pollution, more asset inflation, or companies controlling more of the society, the economy. So we really have to appreciate, and this is where teaching the last 10 years in China, Hong Kong, and the US, and last year in Taiwan have really taught me that priorities change over time. And we need to really respect each other's views. And so aggregate growth simply cannot be what high-income societies keep looking for. So what Taiwan is now in terms of this trap, Taiwan is going to be the highest growth economy among the 5 high-income societies that I'm talking about: Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. But of course, to go back to what you were saying, having the highest GDP growth means very little if we are not helping the people who need help. And I think that the tightrope between finding ways out of socioeconomic problems, that is one part of the issue. And the other part of the issue is value-driven. And this is also very similar to Hong Kong's issue when people say Hong Kong and Taiwan is just a matter of the economy declining. But that's not it. I think that young people in Taiwan and in Hong Kong value their identity in ways that they want to fight for it. They want to strive for a better society. And we need to step back and say, how do we achieve that as a community? And that is what I call this as the double bind. The double bind is basically trying to find a way out of the socioeconomic challenges facing high-income society, which usually means China. Because China, after all,
It's so close. They speak the same language as Taiwan.
but more importantly, of course, as you said, it's so easy to work with them, but more importantly, they're growing at 5%, if you don't believe the official data, at least 5%, but that is still multifold over working with the other high-income societies. And politically, of course, China is providing Taiwan wonderful opportunities, incentives like the 31 preferential treatment, the 26 preferential treatment, and many, many more to come, I believe. So on one side, you have to work more closely with China to get out of the trap. But working with China has its cost.
The double bind.
Yes, and the other side of the bind is that the closer you are working with China economically and socially, the more likely that your values could be eroded. For example, disinformation campaign affecting Taiwan's democracy, it is a real threat because it's a different way of governance, and integration could mean diluting Taiwanese values. And so this double bind, simply put, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. It's great to work with China and it's terrible to work with China.
I guess Other countries, off the top of my head, Australia is facing their own China dilemma. Even the United States in some ways, right? I mean, you've spoken before about how Taiwan's economic relationship with China is unique and universal.
I think the uniqueness, of course, and this comes back to a question, is ethnic identity, your ultimate identity. Or can people choose their identity in terms of civic values and not be bound by the way they look, their blood? And so I often joke that my children remind me this all the time. If blood determines who I am, then I'll be damned.
That's me too.
So children really teach us a lot all the time because they say I am who I am and I'm going to choose the values that are important to me. But in 2019, I think that to realize that Taiwanese people can be distinctive, can uphold values that they as a community choose to prioritize is something very special because it's fully democratic and people have a voice. And when people don't have a voice, like in Hong Kong, you can see that people can become very frustrated and society can be ruptured, which creates problems on all fronts. On the other hand, it is a universal problem because China is trying to extend its, I wouldn't say way of life, I suppose its value system, its way of governance to influence other communities, other countries and institutions, especially international institutions. And so this is something that is universal. Even if you're Australian, if you're American, as you said, higher education institutions, which I'm very involved with, are very worried about infiltration of Chinese researchers or students. And this is causing problems for many of my Chinese students who are studying abroad. I teach mainland Chinese students both in Hong Kong and in the US. And of course, there's a lot of pressure on them now. But this is something that you can appreciate because in democratic societies, there's no way to ban specific ways of speech or trying to, as you can see, challenges facing Facebook. How do you actually filter information in a free and democratic society? In China, censorship.
You just have the, firewall. That's right.
In 2 seconds after you post something that is unsavory, it will be gone. But you can't do that in Taiwan or in the U.S. So it's a universal problem. Can the U.S. System, way of governance, be compatible with the Chinese way of governance? Can we have leaders with different value system competing or cooperating or collaborating? And this is the big question for the next generation.
Now, you are in Taiwan still temporarily, I think this month. You were saying that you had a chance to speak to some young people, some of them your students or even former students. What were those conversations like?
Yeah, so I spoke at National Taiwan University this week as well as National Zhengzhi University, and the Q&A was absolutely the highlight. Students wanted to know, can our government, the Taiwanese government, be more pragmatic? So I said, what does that mean? They said, pragmatic in the sense that can they secure our future, make sure that we can go work anywhere we want, which means China.
Including China.
And at the same time, make sure that Taiwan is safe, that our values are secured, and that we will have the society that we want. The question is a common question. And what they're really saying is we are Taiwanese, but we want to have economic opportunities like anybody else. And I think back, and I think it's the same issue. I have students at University of Virginia who study Russian. They want to go work in Moscow. And they want that opportunity, whether or not the Russian government and the U.S. government are at odds. And I think that for young people in Taiwan, they are not so worried about national identity in the way that the older generations are obsessed over whether you're Taiwanese or Chinese. To them, this is a non-issue. And this is what my book talked about. Once everyone believes that they're Taiwanese, politicians will have to show that they understand policy. They understand economic policy, governance, and are experts at public policy. They can't just say, vote for me because I am like you. What does that really mean? Young people don't buy that at all. Do you stand for same-sex marriage? Do you think that we should continue to have nuclear power? How should we conduct labor reform? How should we conduct pension reform? I think young people want to know how can their voice be heard, but they don't want governments that are ideological that would take away opportunities that could be available to young people everywhere else in the world. And I think that puts both the DPP and the KMT in a very difficult position.
What are you hearing from the students that you teach in mainland China or the students in American universities?
Young people today, I think, have a lot more in common with each other than with their family members. I think young people everywhere actually want more freedom. They want more individual freedom, and teaching in China and in Hong Kong, which has more than 60% mainland Chinese students in my program, which is a master's program, mainland Chinese students that I've taught in Virginia, in Hong Kong, and in Beijing, and in Shenzhen at Tsinghua University, all expressed their desire for more freedom, for democracy for China. And this is not something I think that people know a lot about because you don't have polls in China. And I think if China were to have any, there's some that are city-based, you would see that the younger generation are very liberal. But at the same time, there's something that tugs at them, and that is this contradiction between being nationalist, patriotic, and being liberal. They want what's good for the country, for themselves. And many of them believe that they want a free and open society. But they're not sure, quote, democracy as we see it today is the right solution. So there's a real market for somewhat of a more controlled society. But I would say that in Taiwan, too, many young people. So at National Taiwan University, one of the students asked, why should we be in a democracy? Don't you think there are real problems with democratic governance? Basically, he's echoing what some Chinese students would say when I teach them in Virginia or in Hong Kong. So this is a question that is everywhere in the world, and young people have the same issues. What is the best kind of government? And how can we both efficient and fair and create a free society? And I think that Americans also have the same issue. American students today say, why are we voting for this president and spending the last 3 years impeaching him? And what does it mean to live in a democratic society when we go to public places and we're not allowed to talk about all kinds of things? Everyone's self-censor now in the U.S. because it's so sensitive. People's feelings are hurt. And when you don't have open discussions, you secretly go to the polls, you vote for somebody, and you don't want to tell other people about it. And I think that this is a real issue, that societies are fractured and polarized, but young people have so much in common.
What advice do you have for young people?
Because I've been in the private sector and been a researcher for now equal length of time, young people always ask me, do you think I should go into academics, or should I go into investment banking, or should I join a startup, since my really experience is funding startups? And I always tell students, you just have to be good at what you do. Because once you are good at what you do, whether you're a chemist or you're a banker or an accountant, one day you can contribute to your community. Whether you're an American student, a student from Hunan, and whether you're Taiwanese, you will know when the time is right for you to be involved in public service or be involved with an NGO. But if you don't have any skills and specialty, you can't help anybody, not even yourself. So that's my advice. But the second piece is not quite advice, but the one remark I want to make, because the last 5 years, my students all around the world have changed quite a bit. Many of them are losing faith in their government. And at University of Virginia, more than half of our students go into government. And in Hong Kong, most people go into finance and real estate. But most young people want to be part of their community and make a contribution. Yet, in the last few years, people are saying, I don't trust my government. I don't want to have anything to do with it. And that attitude can be distressing because you don't feel that you can do anything to change the world. But I think that it's important for young people to go out there and vote as a start and be focused on your civic duties, be a citizen that cares, that knows, and raise the standard so that your society's community, country can become a better place.
I'm going to have my kids listen to this episode, Shirley.
Thank you, JR. I don't even think my kids will.
Shirley, it took you 10 years for Taiwan's China Dilemma to be published. When can we expect your sequel?
So the next book is called The High Income Trap in East Asia.
Hey, that's 3 words. I think your publisher will like that.
I've been giving a lot of talks, and I've published Chinese articles about Hong Kong's high-income trap, and an article about Taiwan's high-income trap is coming out. I intend to spend time in South Korea, in Japan, and in Singapore in the next 2 years to finish sort of my field work. So I'm hoping for sure before the next Taiwanese and American presidential election that the book will come out. But I'm hoping it will be a lighter book that will be a faster read, because I think it's an issue that everybody wants to know about. And I want this to create more discussions about how high-income societies can help young people get out of the trap and integrate with the global political economy.
I think there's a lot of food for thought already with your first book. I can't wait for your second book. Thank you so much, Shirley Lin Syaru, for speaking with us today. How do we find out more about you?
Thank you. Well, I'm on Facebook, and also you could look me up on my website, shirleylin.net. All of my talks and my articles will be on the website.
I actually already knew that. I read it all.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shirley. This has been the Taiwan Take.
This has been a Ghost Island media production based in Taipei, Taiwan. This episode was produced and edited by me, Emily Waiwu. Our researcher is Sam Robbins. Additional production support by Allison Chan. Brand design by Thomas Lee. Catch you next time. Bye.